Morning Herald is having some impact in China and around the world. I've had, just in the last couple of weeks, hedge fund managers, senior presidential advisors in the US come to see us, ambassadors from the Beijing diplomatic community, because no one really knows what's going on in China, and anybody that has some insight is a very sought-after commodity. And at the moment, the Sydney Morning Herald is providing that function.
The most interesting stories I've covered for Fairfax would include the Bali bombings, the Iraq War, or the invasion of Iraq, 2003, the Lebanon War in 2006, the aftermath of the tsunami in Aceh, and most recently the flotilla that was headed to Gaza.
I'd like to think that the influential articles I've done are too numerous to count, but perhaps the most influential I fired up early on in my career about the outrage of Australian rugby even thinking of going to South Africa to breach sanctions against apartheid, and I'd like to think that that had some effect in keeping us home.
The article that I'm probably most proud about is something I actually wrote quite recently about copycats in the fashion industry, other designers copying other designers. And I got some great feedback from people saying that they actually sent the article out to people they knew that were ripping off other designers. So I think if a piece that I've written can have that kind of impact, that's quite exciting.
What I find is that when I say something a particular bunch of politicians agree with, they love it and they quote me in question time. When I say something they don't agree with, they don't mention me, but maybe their opponents do.
A recent article I've written that I'm proud of would be to do with the Penrith by-election. We predicted 4 weeks out that the swing would be 25% against New South Wales Labor. That turned out to be the case, and it also had flow-on effects. Indeed, it went as far as being part of the reason for the removal of Kevin Rudd.
The very first review I wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald in 1994 was a tiny little restaurant in King's Cross that had only been open a week. And I wrote this review not knowing what to expect, went along, and it was a little chef called Guillaume Brahimi, and it was his first job as a head chef in a restaurant. And of course it created such big news, and he went on to greater things from then on. And I sort of feel nice to have had perhaps a little hand in his career.
In July last year, I was in Xinjiang at the far west of China, and I received a phone call, and somebody asked me, "What's happened to Stern Hu?" And I said, "What has happened to Stern Hu?" And all of a sudden it turned out he'd been arrested, not only that, 3 of his colleagues. And so the next morning, readers in Sydney and Melbourne woke up to our article in the Sydney Morning Herald, letting them know that Stern Hu had been arrested. That became news immediately after our story in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times. And for the rest of, really, the next 12 months, the rest of the world was following what we were reporting in the Sydney Morning Herald.
If your whole life runs before you on your deathbed, the moment at the Herald that will run past my eyes on my deathbed will be interviewing the American President, George Bush Sr. I had 6 minutes with him, 1st of January 1992, and New Year's morning. And I had he went for a run, and I chased after him and caught up with him and was able to interview him. And that was really something. And I interviewed him, and as I'm talking to him, I'm thinking, this sounds a lot like gibberish, but he's the President of the United States, leader of the free world. I'm a junior burger from the Sydney Morning Herald. When I get down and I write all this down, it'll be fantastic. And I got back to the Herald and I wrote it all down, word for word, and sure enough, it was gibberish.
I had a great moment on the red carpet of the Emmys over in LA. And, you know, when you're overseas, you do that really strong Aussie accent thing because they love it. So I went up to Tom Hanks and I'm like, "G'day, Tom. I'm Shelley from Australia. You know, you're big down under." And so he just burst out laughing. He's like, "Rita," and he got his wife to come over so I could repeat it to him. And then I ended up drinking with them for half the night. It was great.
My favourite interaction with the reader is whenever Paul Keating gets pissed off with a piece that we write about him, and he rings up and gives you a half-an-hour piece of his mind for free, which is nice.
The Australian fashion industry is at a really exciting place at the moment. We've got some really, really talented young designers coming through. We've also got some great new faces on the international modelling scene. And Abby Lee Kershaw, who we're filming and photographing today, is one of the biggest names in world modelling at the moment.
I often get state politicians calling me up, but surprisingly, it's not to do with big front-page stories. It's generally to do with small items in gossip columns.
I get asked all the time who my favourite date with Kate was, but I would have to say that I was most excited to interview Kim Kardashian. I love Keeping Up with the Kardashians. It's one of my favourite shows, so that was very exciting. Also Jermaine Jackson, huge fan of the Jacksons. But also we have our local talents like Michael Clark, Lara Bingle that have such big local interests that, you know, the readers can't get enough of.
My readers are interested, intelligent, educated people. They haven't got a degree in economics, but they do want to get their mind around it. And when I can help them understand all this stuff, they are really appreciative.
The cartoon that has had the most reader responses of all time, however banal this may be, was a cartoon that I drew diagrammatically and jokingly explaining the GST. And every accountant in Australia basically contacted me for a copy of that cartoon because they wanted to use it in their seminars where they had to explain the GST to their clients. So that seems to have been, in a way, the most influential.
Metro readers love getting out and catching Sydney's entertainment, and they are people that go to gigs, they are people that catch lots of films and the latest in stage. They're generally a younger reader, Sydney Morning Herald reader, but we catch people from their teenagers all the way up to their 40s.
You know, the great thing about our readers is they feel like they're part of the cool gang because we're telling them exactly what's hot and what's not. I get people coming up going, so anyway, at that party, chat, 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 as if they know me, when really they've just been reading the column. I've got no idea. They feel like they own it. It's like they know what's going on because we're out there finding out.
During an average week, I'd get about 100 or 200 letters or emails from readers, and I find that the best stuff I get is from people who disagree with me.
So a couple of pieces that I've written have really stood out as provoking a lot of interest. One, when I first started the Herald, was writing a piece about my surname, Dick. Got a bit of interest for that. Cheap shot, but I liked it. And more recently, a column I wrote a couple of weeks ago about Penny Wong and her supposed hypocrisy on the two issues of climate change and gay marriage seemed to provoke a lot of feedback, both for me and against me.
My favourite response I ever got is somebody wrote to me on an email and it was about midnight and I wrote back immediately, 12:01, and the thing came back, "Mum, the newspaper's talking back at me."
When I started working for the Herald, I started as a cadet journalist. I was writing about economics even from the beginning, and I got to be the economics editor after about 4 years, and I've never been able to think of anything that I wanted to do more than that.
What I like about the Sydney Morning Herald and Fairfax is that they do still invest in investigative journalism and photography. I think it's really, really important and should continue.
I think as a restaurant reviewer, the only job that matters, the only job that everybody wants is being the restaurant reviewer for the Sydney Morning Herald, because historically it's been the pinnacle of restaurant criticism in this city. Of course, there are other newspapers, there are other reviewers, but the Sydney Morning Herald has been dedicated to the art of dining in this city for many, many, many years.
I chose to come to the Sun Herald because from speaking to them there, I realised that I'd have a lot of freedom to pursue the stories I wanted to do, and I'd get a lot of backing on those stories, and that's been the case.
The reason I chose a career with the Herald was just because you're involved with people at the top of their game, and I wanted to work for a publication where I could be at the top of my game, surrounded by people at the top of their game.
Well, the Herald's been part of Sydney since 1831. It's part of its soul and it's part of its conversation. Without it, we lose a bit of both.